Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today under somewhat different circumstances than normal. We're coming to you remotely from an undisclosed location in Sunderland, and we're really pleased to have with us today Wallace Allen, who covers the business beat and the economics story in Vermont for VT Digger. And great to have you back with us today, and very timely as well. I mean, obviously, a lot of concerns out there about, what the impact of the COVID-19 virus is going to be on the state's economy, as well as the national, and for that matter, the global economies. But we'll focus on here at home and look to you to kind of fill us in on what's been going on in terms of the economics of the state. Obviously, a lot of people out of work that weren't planning on that. A lot of small businesses and large ones, for that matter, closed or shuttered or unable to kind of be operating at their full potential. One thing, just to kind of get us started here, one thing that I thought might be kind of interesting, just to bat around for a minute or two, is you've written a couple of stories in the last few weeks about folks who might be in line to kind of get more money through their unemployment benefits than they would if they were still working and obtaining their regular salaries. I wonder if you could take us into the background of that. What is going on, and is that just sort of a short-term kind of situation that would be obtaining for a couple of months, or a longer one?
Oh, it's definitely a short-term situation. As you probably remember, at the end of March, the state government lawmakers quickly passed a bill to address the reality that a lot of Vermonters were losing their job because of the stay-at-home orders. They were being furloughed or businesses were closing. And that bill extended the eligibility for unemployment insurance for a lot of people who normally wouldn't have been eligible for it. One group was the self-employed. They've never paid into the system. They've never been able to pay into the system. They haven't been part of the system. And that it included all of them, sort of the hairstylists and the millions of different independent contractors out there. And the other thing that bill said was that people could get unemployment insurance if they needed to leave their jobs because they felt unsafe at their job, or they needed to stay home with their kids who were suddenly out of school, or they needed to care for a family member. At the same time, Congress passed a bill which does many, many things, a $2 trillion stimulus package, but among other things, it adds $600 to everybody's unemployment check. So that means that for people who are getting the maximum unemployment benefit, which is a little over $500, that's an $1,100 a week unemployment payment. And these are good for several weeks, generally till the end of July. And for people who are already on unemployment, their unemployment has been extended. So they'll be able to take advantage of that. And lawmakers and Congress wanted to do that because they knew some people were going to be thrown into an emergency situation unlike anything ever anticipated, where just work vanished right away, or for the independent contractors, their business just vanished overnight because they had to close it. So now the Vermont Chamber of Commerce and the Lake Champlain Chamber of Commerce have been getting a lot of letters from employers saying, how can we keep our workers, those essential employers who are still operating, if they can earn much more by leaving? I mean, that $600 alone is a $15 an hour wage, and a lot of the employers just can't match something like that. So that was the unintended consequence that I wrote about.
Well, it certainly seems like, if a worker is thinking about that in terms of a 3-month kind of situation, I would think a lot of them would say, well, it would be nice to make a little bit more on unemployment for a couple of weeks or a month or so, but then what? I know the employment situation was very tight in Vermont before COVID-19 arrived, but I wonder, they wouldn't necessarily be guaranteed to get their jobs back either, I would think.
Right. That, and a lot of people get benefits so that they can't just leave their jobs, or they would lose their health insurance and things like that. Right. So, I mean, there have been some employers reporting that people have been asking to be laid off so they could collect that unemployment benefit. And other employers have said they think people are leaving because of that benefit and because they need to stay home. And
Right.
there's also, we know because we see them out there working, that there's a lot of people who are still working in jobs that do put them at risk in the healthcare and in the grocery stores and in the hardware stores and all over the place. But state lawmakers have decided to address this by adding a type of pay. Some people have called it hazards pay. Some people really say they haven't come up with a good name for it yet. That would supplement the pay of people who stay on the job in their essential work if they're forced to work in a situation that puts them at risk. That's not for people who can work remotely, but it's for people who do come in contact with the public. And they're talking about that this week. That was led by Senator Tim Ashe. He put a group together to see if they could come up with some way of supplementing pay and also using federal money to do it.
All right. Well, interesting story to follow for sure. Another one, another theme that I've seen written about by you and some of your colleagues at VT Digger has been how Vermont companies have been sort of retrofitting or retooling their production lines to build medical equipment like ventilators and face masks and stuff like that for the frontline medical workers. That must have been kind of interesting to go around and talk to some of those business folks about how they're managing to do that, so quickly on the fly.
It's really, really interesting. Mind you, I'm not going around anywhere, but I'm
Right.
talking to them all for sure. And it's been fascinating to hear how this pandemic has been affecting different companies in the state. The early adopters, almost immediately, the distilleries started making hand sanitizer. A lot of them did in Vermont and nationally and even internationally, because a lot of them have a license to procure the type of alcohol that is needed to actually kill germs and viruses. And they had the equipment and they had the staff, and they wanted to, in many cases, they started by donating it, but in some cases now they're actually going into business doing it because they need a pivot right now to stay in business. And then hard on their heels were companies all over Vermont that donated masks at the request of hospitals, those N95 masks, and other safety equipment that they had. And then companies started looking for ways to help by building things like ventilators, which were a very critical need at the beginning of this. And one interesting development out of all this is that the Vermont companies that have ties in China, and they already have open relationships with agents in China who've been working with them, have been able to get masks where it's been difficult for the hospitals and for other institutions and for the state, which normally don't have close relationships with people in China. One of those companies is Concept 2. They make the rowing machines and the oars in Morrisville and other athletic equipment. First of all, Concept 2 completely sold out of all of their stock of athletic equipment because everybody decided to use their time at home to do that. The Trevor Brown, who's he's one of the engineers there, told me that in fact people are hauling out their 40-year-old rowing machines and calling up and trying to get parts for them. But meanwhile, Concept 2, they closed because they're a non-essential business. But Trevor Brown, who has been to Asia many times to talk to factories there and talk to their suppliers for for the sprockets and the gears that they use for their workout machines, he called the state and said, I have people who can get us gear there. So today, in fact, is the day that 500,000 KN95 masks, which are the Chinese equivalent of the N95s, are supposed to land at Concept 2's loading dock in Morrisville and will be distributed to local health providers. And then the state is going to put them in one of its storehouses for future need. And there's a lot of that protective equipment that is starting to come in now, thanks to help from people who work at Vermont companies and have connections overseas.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Really, really interesting how the private sector was able to make that work. I guess the other thing I've been wondering about is what you've been hearing elsewhere around the Vermont business community in terms of how long they're going to be able to kind of remain in lockdown or shutdown mode. We've been hearing at the national level, there's been a certain amount of pressure being put on on the federal government to reopen the economy, shall we just say sooner rather than later. That there comes a point where the carnage that's going on economically is going to really be difficult to recover from, and that reopening businesses that are maybe somewhat non-essential would be a good thing to see happen not too far down the road. Is it your feeling that business folks here in Vermont are beginning to feel the same kind of urgency that, hey, we just can't stay closed forever?
Oh, for sure. First of all, I'm hearing from a lot of them, and I know that Governor Scott is, and you can see that in his press conferences. People are asking him about that directly, and of course, with the president saying that he has the authority to get the states to open, Governor Scott came out and said, well, we're going to work on this according to what we think is best for the long-term health of the state, economic and health-wise. And he has demonstrated that he is not planning to just go along with whatever the president decides to do in terms of opening the economy. But he's under very intense pressure because this is, as Joan Goldstein, the Economic Development Commissioner, put it, I mean, this is causing acute pain for people. So, and there's an expectation of very long-term pain in a lot of industries as these places close. There's an expectation that a lot of them might not reopen, especially restaurants and businesses with thin margins. So yeah, there's a lot of questions being asked, but I think it was, so the governor has a press conference Monday, Wednesday, and Friday now at 11 in the morning. That's something that a lot of people can listen in on, not just journalists. And he doesn't do that in normal times. And in the last one, or I think it was maybe the one before last Friday, he actually brought out a deck and showed the modeling that the state is using to determine when it's going to be safe to reopen. And they're relying on the advice of epidemiologists and statisticians and people who know how disease spreads and how to assess risk. They can't just bow to the pressure to open businesses to try to get the economy running again, because they feel that there would be long-term harm to doing that there'd be another wave and everything would have to close again, and that the harm could actually be worse if that happened.
Yeah, that would be very difficult to deal with a second wave after we just sort of think, oh, we're out of the woods and can go back to quote unquote normal again.
I don't think
I mean, one
anybody.
of the sectors down here that I'm sure, like in other parts of the state, is probably looking forward to the summer and fall seasons with a certain amount of concern is the tourism industry, which is such a big part of the state's economy. What do you think is the outlook for this coming summer? Too far to look ahead to the fall because we're still deep in the woods here, but and no one really knows how this is all going to wind up playing out. But do you think that the summer season is just sort of a lost cause at this point, or is that going to hinge on if we reopen again, let's say by May 15th, a month or so from now, like the governor's most recent shutdown order is having us stay?
That's the million-dollar question. Nobody knows. Even I mean, that's why there's so many stories in the media looking at what other nations have done and how quickly they've been able to rebound or suppress the spread. Nobody knows what's going to happen this summer. Everybody is waiting to find out. Right now, summer camps are operating on the expectation that they will be able to take kids, but they're really not going to know. The COVID-19 is a little bit unpredictable, and there have been stories about flare-ups happening again in places where it seemed to be suppressed. So there's not a person who can predict if the businesses are going to be able to reopen this summer. That said, the lodging industry was one of the few sectors that got a little boost of hope from the governor last Friday. He had issued an order closing all of the inns and B&Bs and Airbnbs and all of the vacation rentals. And the Attorney General's office had actually sent people out to check to make sure that they really were closed. And at that time, they were also not allowed to take bookings for the future. However, last Friday, Governor Scott lifted that prohibition and said they can start taking bookings for the future starting on June 15th. He also warned, you may have to cancel them because we don't know what's going to happen, but at least now they can take future bookings, because they had been saying, look, we need to take bookings for next summer. Some people plan their weddings or their events a year in advance. So they're one of the few sectors of the economy that has gotten a little tiny easing of restrictions so far.
And it'll be interesting to see how those bookings start coming in. If people will indeed start thinking, okay, in July, I think I will take that vacation in Vermont, like we were thinking about doing in January. But I'm sure there's going to be an awful lot of people who are either financially or psychologically traumatized by this whole experience we're going through now. That I suppose there's two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, be nice to kind of get away from it all for a couple of days in the summer, or else there will also be folks who will be thinking, I just can't afford it this time, or it's too risky or something.
Right. Yeah. Although
it'll be interesting to see kind of how that plays out. What is the sense you're picking up from your folks that you talk to about whether or not the current level of state and federal supports, the CARES Act and the other stimulus or recovery packages that either have been enacted so far or may yet be enacted, are they going to be enough to get us through?
It sounds like certainly the federal funding for the small businesses, that another stimulus package will be needed, because there's a lot of talk that the first one isn't going to be enough for businesses. It's mostly in the form of loans, but some of those loans are going to be forgiven. A lot of small businesses have jumped on that. And where the state unemployment fund is concerned, we had a $500 million unemployment trust fund. The latest estimates are that that's going to run out by the end of the summer. And then it'll be up to taxpayers and our newly growing economy, hopefully, to start building that up again. It's anyone's guess. I think right now it's a little bit hard to assess what's going on with unemployment, because the Department of Labor has been so overwhelmed by applications that they have been struggling to process all the claims. And while they are processing claims, there are still thousands of people who haven't been able to get their claims processed. I'm hearing from tons of them all the time with questions. The Department of Labor is holding town hall meetings online, and you can see from, because people can submit written questions that we can see as we're watching the town hall meeting, and there's just, so many people who haven't been able to get their money for one reason or another. So it'll become a little clearer over the coming weeks and months as the self-employed people are able to file, which they're expected to be able to do this week for the first time, and as other people who haven't been able to get their claims processed, it'll be clear exactly what cost we're looking at here.
Yeah, and the bottlenecks that have apparently been part of that, and in fairness, the banking community was asked to do an awful lot very quickly to process those loans, but it will certainly be important to get that done. I was just wondering, you were talking about the governor's press conference there a moment ago, and having watched a few of them myself, they've been certainly fascinating and informative. What's it been like as a reporter on the behind the scenes from that? There's no one in the room, I gather, other than maybe a cameraman, and you're all off in your remote locations and you're calling in. Is that the way it works?
Well, it is for me. I have been completely remote since it started, but there are reporters in the room at the governor's press conference keeping their distance. So the way it works is he starts talking, and he has his top officials either on the phone or in the room with him, like Mark Levine is either there in person or he's on the phone. And Mike Sherling, who's the head of the Department of Public Safety. And first they go around the room and ask the people who are present. First, the governor talks about his latest. He usually presents numbers about how the actual infections and if there's any deaths. And then they talk about their latest directives, and then they take questions. And it's really interesting because we've never had a story of this size. Most of us in our lifetimes, all of us have never had a story of this size. And so this is all new for all of us. And it's developed in an interesting way. The reporters RSVP to the press conference, and then they're placed in that order, and then they have to unmute themselves and talk, and we're all getting much better at it. And it's also interesting to talk to state officials just in general, because we now have conversations at all odd hours and in all kinds of odd places. For a long time, I was in a place where I couldn't really get a very good cell phone connection, and I was working out of my car a lot, and I'd be having a lot of Zoom meetings in my car in the parking lot of a library in Addison County, which has really good internet. And I'd be talking to state officials who were at home, and there's sort of this, it was sort of like an all hands on deck feeling of like, I can't return your call until 8 o'clock tonight. And then I have to wonder, gosh, do I even really want to tax this poor person who's been working for 12 or 13 hours already with this call? And it made me be very mindful about bothering people.
Yeah. It certainly, like you say, biggest story of our lifetimes, no question. Two takeaways I've had from this is that the Department of Labor is probably going to be in line for an upgrade on their 30-year-old computer system. It sounded like it's time to get some more equipment in there. That must have been just crazy those first couple of weeks when you were getting hit with tens of thousands of applications, way more than they do a year.
This kind of illustrates how our political system is set up in a way that does not reward politicians who campaign on things like rebuilding the Department of Labor computer system. It really rewards politicians who campaign on things that people can relate to directly and that are more emotional, like hunger and education. So the state, like all states, has disinvested over the years in a lot of crucial positions, and that has left them sort of shorthanded. There's also Vermont's aging population means that at the Department of Labor, there's one person who's been working on that mainframe for the last 30 or 40 years. And, there aren't that many other people who know it. And all of those things have caused some of the backlogs at the DOL.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see what vulnerabilities and weaknesses this has exposed, and more to come too, I suppose. Well, Anne, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you carving the time out of I'm sure is a very busy day, and we'll let you get to that governor's press conference, which will be happening in about another 45 or so minutes. But again, good luck and be safe out there. And it's a whole different world.
It is. Thanks, Andrew. Take care of yourself.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching, and thanks to Ann Wallace Allen, who is the business writer for VT Digger. You can read her stories at vtdigger.org. Ann, thanks again for being with us today.
Thanks, Andrew. See you later.
Okay, take care.